Okay, I think we are now good to go. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar to look at the progress and practice of virtual events for planning inquiries and other events run by PINs. So I hope that we can have a useful conversation around how things are going and how we might take it forward. We have a number of speakers who are all going to speak fairly briefly. We've only got an hour, so I want to leave as much time as possible for questions. We have got some questions come in already. Can I ask you to leave the chat until we get to some of the topics, and then you're welcome to add questions on the chat. And can I also ask you to ensure that your cameras are off and your mics are on silent, so we can make sure we've got the best use of bandwidth that we can. And also to remind you that this is being filmed, this event will be recorded, and you will be able to refresh your knowledge of it later, or indeed send it to others who are unable to attend. So without further ado, let's move on and make best use of our time to introduce to start with, and then call each of them in turn. 3 to 4 minutes each, guys, and I will be telling you. I've got my clock going. I'll be yelling at you if you take too long. First of all, we're going to have Christine Thorby. Christine is head of operations. Christine is director of strategy. Simone, otherwise director of strategy at the Planning Inspectorate, and was previously a planning inspector with huge experience. Sat with me on the review of planning inquiries. Then we'll move to Simone Wilding, who is head of operations for the Planning Inspectorate and was also very important to the delivery of the Rosewell review of planning inquiries. Then I'll turn to Jonathan Easton, who is planning barrister at King's Chambers and with the Planning and Environmental Bar Association. I'm sure most of you know that that is PIBA. He is representing them as well on this occasion. And then Catherine Earlman, who is the principal planner at Braintree District Council. Finally, Simon Gallagher will wrap up the presentations. He's Director of Planning at Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. He and I have recently sat together on the task force for the planning bill. He knows everything that is going on in MHCLG. I'm sure it'll help me saying that. Anyway, let's kick off. Christine, over to you and your initial 5 minutes.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Bridget, and hello everyone. Thank you for joining. I've got a bit of the narrative behind how we've got to where we are now with virtual events. And, I have to start off by saying this has been such a transformative year for us all, particularly for the Planning Inspectorate. So if we go back and think about mid-March, overnight, we had to stop running face-to-face events. Everyone went home from the office, and we had to work out pretty quickly how to keep everyone safe and what we were going to do about casework. Of course, we couldn't just sit on it until the pandemic went away. And we knew that the courts were already running events virtually, and we had been thinking about using technology for a while. And indeed, one of Bridget's recommendations from her inquiry review had been that we use technology at inquiries to reach a greater audience and enable better participation. So it was on our radar, but at most a twinkle in the eye, I would say. So in the first few weeks, with tremendous support from PIBA, the planning industry and MHCLG to pursue virtual events, we took the decision to start setting these up. It did take time to get it right, and we set up a project group. We looked very carefully at roles and responsibilities, making sure we could give people a fair hearing and could test the evidence, and that all parties could participate using technology. So the most important thing was that the purpose of the event was not undermined. And it took us to the beginning of May, which is when we ran our first event. It was a small-scale hearing. It was our breakthrough moment. We were very excited. And of course, it went well, ran just like a hearing with no drama. So inquiries followed rapidly. And just 6 weeks later, we ran 4 weeks of hearings for the highly complex South Oxfordshire local plan examination. I have to acknowledge that it took a monumental effort and weeks of planning to set up the examination hearings. And the things that trip you up, such as data protection, enabling the programme officer to have access to systems were unexpected and not things that we'd had to think very much about before. So now, 9 months later, we're mostly virtual. All events are running relatively smoothly. And I do want to mention the Holocaust Memorial. Again, that was 4 weeks of sitting, a really high profile and sensitive case with very high profile witnesses. And when you think of what would have been necessary, even just for the security arrangements, if it ran under the old system, I think we have to recognise that it was a fantastic achievement. And these events have happened because of rapid improvement in use of technology and our joint effort and learning in how to run virtual events. The feedback from events has enabled us to develop data and digital matters, training and guidance, and helped us to improve. And all of this is ongoing. So if we go back to Bridget's recommendation, this was the recognition that technology can help reach wider communities and encourage greater participation. We have seen that virtual events have proved that right. The technology has proved that right. As far as we can tell, South Oxfordshire examination hearings, we had over 15,000 views over 4 weeks and a total of 6,900 viewing hours. And interestingly, something like 64% were on a computer and 23% via a mobile. The Holocaust Memorial saw something like over 20,000 total viewings across all sitting days. But we have also trialled a small number of blended events where the inspector was there in person, with some parties socially distanced, and there was a virtual element to allow greater participation. And needless to say, these events required an even greater effort to enable and a willingness of the local authorities to take on the task, including investing in technology, but they were equally successful and had a very positive feedback. So this has been revolutionary for us. The upside for virtual events, as we know, don't have to travel, no lonely hotels. Comments are sometimes it's easier for the inspector to see and to speak to the parties, can be less intimidating for witnesses, got longer breaks, caring responsibilities can be managed better. On the other side, we know that we're human, we crave human interaction, not that inspectors can interact socially at events. Our eyes get tired, 3D models might not work, and not everyone is good at using technology, and it isn't always reliable. So the big question is, where do we go from here? Well, we know that we're unlikely to go back into the old system as it was. It's less flexible, less inclusive, and technology will be a key to our future operating model. We've set up a cross-organisation project group, and we'll have to manage a transition to any new system to make sure it's reliable and stable. The things we need to consider: purpose and objectives of the Inspectorate. We're held accountable in standards of performance, independence and access to information. There must be confidence in the process as we work in highly contested areas. Different customer and stakeholder needs and perspectives need to be considered, not just our direct appellants and applicants, interested parties, but also government departments, MHCLG and statutory bodies. We need to consider longer term trends which will influence public expectation in the way in which they interface with us. Crucially, tying in with ambitions of the White Paper, Planning for the Future, and reforms in the National Infrastructure Process and Strategy. So it's likely to be evolution rather than a big bang, one-step approach. And we need to understand the relationship with digital platforms and systems to align these. So we do need to also appreciate that the work undertaken in different areas, appeals, plans, enforcement, infrastructure and specialist, and find a consistency of approach and use the flexibility that we have now with the hybrid written reps, hearing and inquiries approach. And we need to look at a range of options and be open to ideas, and absolutely not forgetting well-being and people. So this is no easy task, and we want to work with you. And the webinar is the start of that discussion. Thank you, Bridget.
Okay, thank you, Christine. And Yeah, slight overrun there. So I'm hoping that my other speakers will be succinct. So first of all, over to Simone Wilding for the sort of the operational aspect to this. Simone. You're on mute.
First, yes, of course. Right, so our aim is to keep all casework moving and to share learning across areas. We've now held virtual events across all casework areas and scaled up to 100 cases per month, and it's still growing. In total, we've delivered virtual events on almost 400 cases, and in many casework areas, a case actually means weeks or a more virtual sitting time. So we estimate that it's probably now around 1,000 virtual event days in total that we've delivered so far. And it's really good to see all the casework areas today represented in the webinar and having provided questions in advance. Some cross-cutting ones, others quite specific, and some challenges reflect the different underpinning legislation and different practice. As we don't have long, I will only cover 3 cross-cutting challenges here, but hopefully have time to go on to some specifics later. So firstly, electronic document handling. Ideally, clearly, we should have a quick and easy way that everybody can find what they need, and the system should drive up quality of documents to be concise, consistent, well organized. And we recognize it needs improving in all areas, even if the extent of the challenge varies. Our new portals will fix that. And we share the frustration about how long it's taken to materialize. The last 9 months have further underlined how crucial the need for flexible systems is. Unfortunately, our previously pursued technology did not provide that flexibility, nor was it cost effective. And we therefore had to take the difficult decision to stop the previous pilot and restart. We've now made really good progress on a new digital appeal service, including gaining GDS approval for the alpha stage. We've launched a new private beta, so that's a live trial for householder appeals, and we expect to complete the new digital HAS service in the next 3 to 4 months. And that then provides us the digital foundation to quickly scale up across all appeal types, so including inquiries, and hopefully then by next autumn we finally have what we want. For national infrastructure and other application type services, just last week we kicked off the process of building a new digital application service, so to eventually replace our current website. We're building that with customer needs at the centre, and we'll seek input from those of you interested in this over the coming months. So my second cross-cutting challenge is live streaming. It offers the greatest potential in my mind for massively opening up access, particularly from underrepresented groups. At the same time, it's the most resource intensive and technically challenging aspect. We as the Inspectorate can now live stream up to 4 cases simultaneously. Clearly not enough to cover all events. It also seems a mixed landscape among local authorities. Some can stream in a GDPR compliant manner, others can't, and many can only do it if they buy in special resource. Over time, technology will improve that and make it easier. But until then, the key question seems how many and which cases should be live streamed, who does it, and how much should we pay for it? And then the third cross-cutting and last challenge, to ensure fairness and a robust process, we need to enable all who want to participate to be able to do so, making the virtual event open to all sorts of equipment, including phones, and providing simple guidance. But despite those best efforts in making virtual access simple, some can only participate if digital assistance is provided. And hence sometimes it's necessary, particularly where fundamental rights are concerned, to provide a physical place from where the digitally excluded can participate, either in a physical or a virtual meeting, but the technology needs to be taken care of by others. The Inspectorate only controls 1 venue in England, so we need others to provide local digital assisted access points. Could either be the local authority, the applicant, or the appellant. So in summary, we can all be extremely proud of what's been achieved in a short space of time, yet there's still a lot more to do. Going back to purely physical events would now seem a retro step, Rather, we're keen to hear suggestions on how to keep improving. So please do fill in the feedback form at the end.
Okay, thank you. So we've heard now from PINS, and both on the how the thing has developed so far, but also on the challenges for the future. And so now let's hear from some practitioners. So first of all, I'm going to turn to Jonathan Easton for his perspective on how this has gone so far.
Thank you very much, Bridget. So most people, I think, on this meeting will know who PIBA are. We're the Planning and Environmental Bar Association. We practice in all areas of planning, environmental and local government law. We've had a very long and productive relationship with PINS, and that's been particularly valuable during lockdown. And we've been very grateful for their inviting us in. They've, in some respects, they've accepted our recommendations on initiatives, and we're more than happy to continue that relationship. Now, what I'm about to say isn't, strictly speaking, a formal PIBA view, because as you expect, different practitioners have different views about how things have gone and how they should go in the future. But so I'm picking out some key themes really that I've got from the feedback that we received. So my general impression from responses received so far is that planning barristers have been impressed with the transition to virtual events, even if PINS took, should I say, slightly longer than some other tribunals to bring in the new system. And inclusivity is a topic that's been mentioned on a number of occasions. Its advantages, virtual events in terms of inclusivity, are slowly becoming apparent. So streaming via YouTube or allowing third parties to contribute via Teams should, and dare I say, has encouraged greater involvement, particularly for those people who aren't always engaged in the planning system. The other interesting side effect that certainly I've noticed is the humanisation of the process. So contrary to popular belief, planning barristers do have children, and some of them have dogs. And my dog's been particularly supportive, and she usually barks during my closing submissions, which I take as support for what I'm saying. Inspectors have roadworks outside their houses sometimes, and planning consultants don't always have Hollywood-style lighting rigs in their home offices. I think that's an important humanising effect for the whole process, that it's not seen as intimidating by people who would be put off being involved previously. This has been mentioned already, but a fairly consistent response, particularly from those barristers with caring responsibilities, has been that virtual events compare very favourably to in-person hearings when it comes to well-being. So historically, long days, sometimes weeks spent away from home, are very demanding and have the potential to impact negatively on family life. And virtual events go some way to rebalancing these personal and professional demands. But there are two contextual points I just want to mention here. It shouldn't be assumed that because barristers aren't commuting or staying in hotels, that they necessarily have more time on their hands. So that the virtual events day tends to start with a client conference around an hour or so before the session starts, followed by a wash-up session after the hearing closes for the day. During breaks during the inquiry, we're taking instructions or taking down points. And so it would be helpful, quite a few people have said, if those factors could be recognised when preparing programmes for virtual events. The other contextual point to note is that traditionally, pre-COVID, appeal hearings weren't held on Mondays. There was a travelling day, but it was also a day when most barristers would try and fit in as many client conferences as possible. That hasn't really changed during lockdown. So whilst the requirement to travel may have been removed, the demands of our practices do remain. So if some consideration could be given to keeping Mondays free, that would be very greatly appreciated. In fact, Mondays could be used as case management conference days for forthcoming appeal events, because some members, and this is a related point, some members have reported that case management conferences are sometimes scheduled on Wednesday, Thursday, or even Friday, when they might be in the middle of another inquiry, which means it makes it very difficult for them to attend. And it hardly needs saying that virtual events are exhausting. So looking at a screen all day is wearing, especially as the brain is constantly searching for the physical cues and body language that are obvious in the real world, which are sometimes impossible to detect in virtual reality. So, but I have to say many, if not most inspectors have recognised this challenge and have programmed sessions accordingly. A good model really is 3 sessions of 1.5 hours with decent breaks in between to allow for recovery and for taking instructions. But this approach hasn't always been consistent. So we think a clear direction from PINs or an agreed protocol for sitting times and lengths of sessions would be an excellent way of ensuring consistency across the board. Similarly, cross-examination, virtual events are not a perfect replacement for the tried and tested in-person system, but cross-examination works over Teams, and it does provide the forensic rigour that many issues do require. But in that context, we'd invite inspectors to resist the temptation to default to roundtable sessions merely because this is seen as easier. So we've adapted the planning bar to virtual events and will continue to do so as necessary. And there's absolutely no reason why the virtual nature of inquiry should diminish the need for the focused testing of evidence. So, I mean, the future is unpredictable. Most of our members recognise there is some form of virtual participation is here to stay, even if not all of them welcome it. There are advantages to virtual hearings, but they aren't a complete substitute for being in the same place as client teams, ability to cross-examine in person, or, for example, inspect 3D models of proposed development. But there's a middle way, and I know we'll talk about this in a moment, but a number of planning events, the Doncaster Local Plan examination in public being one of them. I acted for Doncaster Council with the incredible support of the Planning Inspectorate and the council officers. We were able to have an event where the inspector, the council's team, and on some occasions representatives were in the same physical place, but everybody else attended remotely, and it worked fantastically well. So everybody, well, yeah, I'll just say one more thing. So everyone's proven themselves to be incredibly adaptable. PINs are to be applauded greatly for getting this system off the ground. PIBA remain available to help push this forward in any way that we can assist. Thank you. I know I've run over, Bridget. Sorry.
Okay. Closing submissions, they always run over, don't they? Yeah. So thank you, Jonathan. And let me turn now to Catherine for the local authority perspective on how this is going. And interesting points about the blended ones, and we will come back to that in the question and answer session as well. Anyway, Catherine, over to you.
Great, thank you, Bridget. So I've been asked to speak because in June of this year, I found myself to be the council's planning witness in the Planning Inspectorate's first virtual inquiry. We hadn't been long in lockdown by then, so I did naturally have some questions about how it may all work, which I imagine anybody new to the process would have. I'm not particularly very confident with computers. I had used Microsoft Teams a few times before. I wouldn't say that I felt familiar with it at the time. And I was sort of concerned generally that the platform might not lend itself to the same levels of public participation as a real event. However, I would say it turned out to be very successful. The link which was given by the Planning Inspectorate to those who wanted to view the inquiry was very easy to use, very easy to access. We found nobody had any problems with it, and there were a few councillors who weren't able to join through Microsoft Teams, and in that case they were able to speak using a telephone line, and that seemed to work fairly well as well. I think there is and always will be, I think, concern about internet connectivity. You know, will it hold up? Will it not? Generally speaking, I've seen a few inquiries now that colleagues have done, and there haven't been many issues with it really. I think some of that comes from the fact that, you know, only those who are speaking are the ones who turn their cameras on, microphones on. So that certainly helps with the bandwidth. You know, there's a few occasions, you know, where a link may be lost, connectivity may be lost, but in which case proceedings just pause and then they pick up again. And I don't think that there's ever been anybody sort of disadvantaged necessarily out of that. I think one of the other concerns that I had at the time, not really knowing much about Microsoft Teams and the sort of controls that you can have over it, you know, is what happens to all of these sort of objectors, for example, who are in the meeting with us, can they pipe up at any time? You know, what happens if they do? I know that they like to do so in the gallery quite often when you're in a real inquiry. But I think, you know, there are settings, I think, that can be adjusted. And I think there's one thing about the virtual sort of process. It sort of provides a sort of distance and perhaps a more organisation to the meetings, and it sort of forces attendees and their interactions to perhaps be a little more controlled. It has certainly had a positive effect in my reckoning, and everybody tends to get their say because the inspector makes sure that they do, because they turn to each person one-on-one, and therefore, you know, people aren't left out of the debate, particularly in the round tables. I think for Microsoft Teams going forwards, one of the real advantages which I've perceived it provides is the opportunity to screen share. So certainly I found it very useful when I was giving my evidence, to be able to just ask the inspector, can I bring this policy up on the screen, for example, and then, you know, just point out particular parts of it. And I think that has, certainly when I'm looking at other people, you know, witnessing other inquiries, you know, as not a participant, but just watching from public point of view, it seems that you can't always keep up with the documents. It's hard to find the documents, and it's just so useful if something's brought up on the screen for everybody to see. And I wouldn't like to see that lost, really. I think that's something which really helps with engaging people in the process and allowing them to understand the nuances of the arguments which are really being made. And in other areas, I agree, really, I think it's been mentioned, is the broadcast of inquiries. I mean, it's so useful from a planning professional's point of view to be able to watch other inquiries live streaming, and there's a lot of opportunity there to sort of get interest from, renew, I suppose, public interest in the planning process. So really, I suppose generally it's a positive experience, and I think if I were going to be asked to take part in a virtual inquiry again, I wouldn't hesitate. For me, it helps with my nerves. It's a lot easier, sort of, not to have to see faces looking at you when you're sort of giving your evidence, and when you're sitting there in your slippers, perhaps in your kitchen, and a barrister's grilling you, it's certainly a lot easier from my point of view. But I don't necessarily know how it's like on the other side. But yeah, good experience, really. Thanks, Bridget.
Thank you, and thanks for for both Jonathan and Catherine for the participant perspective. We'll now turn to the sort of policy end of this and ask Simon Gallagher to wrap up the presentations from the point of view of MHCLG. Simon.
Thank you very much, Bridget, and thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. I just wanted to say very briefly three things. The first is that the degree of support that my department, my ministers and I have personally for what we've been doing and what we've been talking about. Planning decision making plays an absolutely critical role in the economy. It is the availability of consents that we can build out as we recover from this pandemic is going to be critical, and that virtual working, which means that we've been able to carry on providing has been absolutely critical for that, and I'm really glad that we have local government to do this. And even if this hadn't been perfect and hadn't had some of the spin-off benefits, it would have been worth doing just for that purposes. We've been supporting it and facilitating it through law, but there's but the real work's being done elsewhere. The second bit, though, is to say, but there have been, and we've heard it today, some of the positive effects of this. And so our judgment at the MHCLG end is that we shouldn't just default back to how we were working before the pandemic. We think there is real virtue in carrying on some of the lessons we have learned from this. Now, we need to learn, we need to have apply this age-old principle in government of testing and learning and making sure that we're picking up things and learning and getting better. And we stand ready to do that. We have been extending some of the temporary flexibilities in the law. We've been trying to create an environment for more digital working across local government. And we're keen to see that learning happening and the improvement happening. But then, and this is my third point, is that I think we need to set this in the context of a long run aspiration to make planning services across local government and the Planning Inspectorate much more modern, digital. You know, if you look in comparison with what happens to many other public services these days, planning is a little bit behind the curve. That is not the fault of anybody in local government or the Inspectorate. What we are trying to work as a department is how can we make planning truly digital, and this area can be one aspect of that. We think there's some spin-off benefits, but the bit I'm really encouraging everybody is to evaluate, work out what is really happening, work out what the impact of this is on participants, on engagement, and on planning and the planning outcomes we get them themselves. So I want to really encourage this as a forerunner for the reforms we'll be seeing over the next decade. Thank you very much, Bridget.
Okay, thank you, Simon. That was indeed succinct, so that's great. I've got back a little bit of time. Thank you very much. So, and thank you everybody for kicking off the considerations. And one of the really striking things, I guess, is actually how positive everybody is about this experience. Even if there are some negative aspects, generally speaking, this has sort of accelerated us up a digital curve, which we would probably have taken ages to get to otherwise. And that's interesting in itself, but it obviously does raise some challenges and some further opportunities, and that's what I'd like to explore in the remaining time. So I think I'd like to start by getting just some feedback around responses to different kinds of topics. So we've got inquiries, we've got local plan inquiries, we've got enforcement, we've got DCO. Is virtual, are the challenges in going in each of those the same, or are there some very significant differences so that one size cannot fit all? Perhaps Jonathan, can I come to you first from the barrister's perspective? How does that feel to you? Do you think we need different ways of thinking about the different topics or different events?
Yes, I do. And one thing I'd like to stress from the outset is that all inspectors I've been in front of have underlined how important it is that fairness and effective participation are at the heart of whatever they do. So, and that's been incredibly impressive. So I think that needs to be the watchword for whatever choice of platform we use going forward. And I don't think there is a one size fits all. I mean, my personal involvement in an EIP lends itself very well to the blended event, because you have a group of people who are staying there for the entirety, where there's other people dip in and out. So the virtual aspect works very well. One of the enforcement, again, that's by and large is more likely to involve lay people. So some clear understanding about the support that PINs and the parties can offer to people who might be digitally disadvantaged is really important. So, I mean, it's not so the answer to your question is, I don't think there is a one size fits all approach. There are different challenges within each of the different types of casework, and within that, different challenges in each kind of case. But provided that PINs carry on in the way that they have done, with participation and fairness being at the heart of decision making, I think we can carry on pretty well, frankly.
So, Christine, is that how it feels from the PINs perspective? Do you see that there being different protocols for different kinds of event?
Yes, I mean, it's entirely possible. I think those really key principles have to underpin everything we do. And that's about the kind of fairness and making sure that whatever we do is fit for purpose. And we just need to look at, I think it's the impact that we want to understand in these different areas. We need to be sure that we underpin everything with common principles, but we have regard to the methods that we're trying to use to test the evidence. That's what we're doing. We want to hear from people and we want to have testing of the evidence. We have found that in all areas, so we've had enforcement, we've had local plans, and we've obviously had inquiries, that they have been successful. I think we've just got to really build on what we've got. And part of the discussion we've been talking about is that building on what we've got and really looking at a model that will take us to maybe 2025, you know, so that we build in things around what's going to happen to local plans, you know, with the planning for the future, what's going to happen, and make sure that we actually build in something that has regard to all of that. So I think, yes, we need to understand the differences between the casework types. Yes, there's common principles that we need to make sure we understand and abide by in any future system.
So there's been quite a few questions that people have put up before the meeting around the local plan part. So why don't we have just a few moments on the local plan thing, and I'll just pull them together, I think, actually. So one about how material is brought into play, and can it continue to be submitted right up to the day, and is there sufficient control over the amount of participation and making sure that there's enough time given and not too much time given to some participants. And then finally, is it an effective use of public money? But maybe that's not a question we can actually answer. Maybe that's only one for Simon, or indeed how we're going to evolve local plan processes with planning for the future. But this question about how you manage that process in a local plan examination. Catherine, how does that, have you been involved in a local plan examination? How does that feel from your perspective?
I haven't been from a virtual perspective, but I've certainly been involved prior to lockdown. Epping Forest District Council did have a local plan inquiry, which I participated with, but I also watched via their webcast. But you know, few weeks really, and I just found that absolutely brilliant. I could get it when I wanted to. I could chip in and out. I could find listen to certain debates and not others, and I found that very, very useful. I was working private practice at the time, and that really worked, balancing it with other parts of my workload. But I think if I wouldn't say my experience of the process is suggesting that people do or don't get more or less of a say. I would say they get pretty much the same amount of say, because when someone wants to speak, they will speak, and they will continue speaking until someone stops them speaking, or they stop. And so, those people who want to speak a lot will do that. But I think it does help those people who necessarily aren't that good in a debate. So, because it does force the inspector to say, what do you have to say? Or now I will turn in turn to each person. And so everybody then tends to get an opportunity. And I think it's the opportunity that sometimes doesn't always arise. And when you're in a sort of real event.
So in fact, so there's something there about the number of participants that you can get, but also, of course, if you get, and I'm sure with the Holocaust inquiry or Holocaust Memorial inquiry, I should say, that Christine referred to earlier, you have got maybe thousands of people coming in. Not everybody will want to say something, but you can't really go round them all. So there's maybe something that the PINS needs to take away about how an inspector chooses to bring people in, or how people present themselves as wanting to participate, rather than just, as you say, Catherine, be able to listen to the debates and to get the web stream and so on. So there's something maybe there that you should take away, and that would actually help manage this participation point. And in terms of submission of material, Christine, is that an issue, do you think?
I think, Bridget, those are problems that were not problems, but those are issues that we had before virtual events. I mean, this has always been about, what happens to material before the local plan hearings. And the principle is that, you have a date and time, there's a process that you stick to, and you should have all your information in at any particular time. And then it is, up to the inspector to look at and have some discretion over any further material. And I think that's just, that shouldn't have changed. I think the way in which the virtual events gives us an opportunity to rethink and set some really clear boundaries again. And it also gives us an opportunity to think about how we want the material presented, what's the best way for us to present it. It does give us opportunities to actually rethink how we view things and how it comes in. It gives us a chance to re-emphasize dates when things should be in, you know, and perhaps set some of that out again. But that is quite clear. You know, there is a clear process for local plans already.
Okay, well, let's move on, I think, to the way that the events themselves might evolve. And indeed, I see somebody's put a question in already, but do feel free to respond to the kind of things that everybody is saying. And a suggestion here that we might keep Wednesdays free rather than Monday if the travelling bit is going away. We'll get a comment on that in a moment. But in the meantime, one of the big topics I think that is coming through, both on the questions that people put in beforehand, but also in some of the things that you said, how do we get the best of both worlds? The blended event. Jonathan talked about Doncaster. Clearly the technology aspects of blending and allowing people to say, are you going to rock up in person or are you going to get on the phone or the computer, is going to be an interesting challenge. Simone, how do you think we're moving forward on this?
Yeah, and in a way, it's quite a good segue from the local plans, because in local plans is where we've done most blended so far, mainly because in local plans it's the sort of the cooperation between PINs and the local authorities is very well established, in the sense where actually they're only the very first two we had run as an inspectorate. All other local plan events, and I think there have been over 20 now as well, were actually delivered by the local authority. And like I said in my piece at the beginning, to do blended, we need that cooperation with the local authority, because they are the ones, well, or it could be the applicant or the appellant, because they are the ones who've got the sort of the rooms locally to people, which we clearly don't have. And however, what we've developed through that work with local authorities in local plans is this sort of cookie cutter, a more of a model, so we can set out concisely to others who haven't done it yet. This is what you need. This is how we can make it work. Can you tell us, can you do it or not? Because otherwise you waste an awful lot of time trying to tailor everything to every individual one, and that's just clearly inefficient and wouldn't work that well. But I think we're making progress in that direction, and I think on that, working together on a model, that's how I see we could make some progress in that area. And certainly I think in, you know, again, like I said in my piece earlier, this for digital assistance, for those who would otherwise be digitally excluded, it's absolutely fundamental.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I suppose some people have said to me that one risk of the existing virtual is that you don't get the right kind of cross-examination, or indeed that topics that should be cross-examined go to round tables because they're somehow easier to manage on a virtual basis and would be better done live in a physical cross-examination. And I don't know whether, well, maybe Jonathan and Chrissy, an experience of these events, is that true? Jonathan's first, and then maybe Christine.
I mean, it's true with this caveat. Like I said in my piece, cross-examination is possible over Teams, but you lose an awful lot of the interaction that you would normally have as an advocate. You lose the body language.
Yeah.
You're constantly looking for visual cues, like I said, that are very difficult to find over Teams because you don't see the whole person. So I think my personal view, and this is a personal view, is that cross-examination I think is more effective in person, but that's not to say that going forward it wouldn't work at all in virtual events. But I do underline the point that we should, I think, be resistant to the idea that doing things in a round table way is somehow easier on Teams, and should avoid that sort of approach. We can still cross-examine, and I don't think that virtual events should make any difference to the topics that are chosen for cross-examination.
I think that's probably then something, you know, given going back to my review, that's something that I will continue to try and help monitor, whether the selection of topics, and particularly in consultation about hybrid inquiries, we will need to really begin to focus on making sure that we're monitoring this correctly, and that how that evolves in terms of those topics. Simone, you've got your hand up, and then quickly from Simon as well. Simone.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe say, at the moment, we seem to be equating roundtable sessions with maybe shorter interventions where actually, where in my mind, we need to look much more. And I think you said that earlier, Bridget, as well, is in sort of evolving how we do the cases more generally. I think part of the problem at the moment is that inquiry sitting is often very long and continuous, and it's that long and continuous that's the problem, because that's making it so tiring, so inhumane. But if we can have maybe shorter cross-examination sessions as well, spread over a longer period, interspersed with more written exchange in between, like you do in NCIB, where I suppose you don't have cross-examination there, but it's the concept of having shorter events with maximising written. I think that is something where we can learn from NCIB. And if I may just snuggle in one NCIB point, because I know it was asked, the key challenge in NCIB at the moment is clearly for us to make the PM to reclaw the time that we're currently losing by having a 2-part PM, to bring that back into one day. But it's a challenge that we're still working on.
Okay. Simon, from a policy perspective, is there anything that you'd like to add around the this question of trying to get the right topics dealt with in the right way?
Yeah, I sort of think this is one where there needs to be a good discussion between people. I don't have a particular policy view. The thing that I'm conscious of, and I say this from personal experience, is that the dynamic changes quite a bit when you've got some people in the room and some people on screen. We've been finding that with briefing ministers, when there's some of you in the room and some of you on the screen, particularly because some of the bit that you've talked about earlier about you have those conversations on the way in and the way out. And I think we need to be really careful about driving sort of fairness and access, that sort of hybrid procedure. On the other hand, it is really exciting as a way of working, and I look forward to seeing some of the opportunities. And I think it's one of those where you can overthink these things, and you just need to try them and see how it works and keep evaluating them.
Experiment is really excellent. I agree. But this question, how we get the right balance between an experiment and a protocol, so you get the right days being free. I mean, does it have to be a Monday? Could it be a Wednesday? Well, I won't ask Jonathan to answer that question, because I think that's again something that we'll need to do a bit of consultation on. But I think just to we've got 10 minutes left ish, and I'd like to kind of think a little bit more about technologies, access to technology, training in technologies. Are we getting that right? Jonathan, I know that you've said people could participate in training programs. What do you have in mind?
Yes, well, this is in response to a question that was asked in advance of this session. So it was, has PIBA been doing Teams training? And I suppose the strict answer to that question is no. It's been done on, I think, on a chambers by chambers basis. Most people are fairly familiar with Teams and Zoom and Skype for Business, but that got us thinking about whether or not it would be sensible to do a joint training session with the Planning Inspectorate, possibly bringing in the RTPI to do, I don't know, a mock virtual event, some do's and don'ts, some basics, because not everybody so far has been involved in virtual events, and so some joint training I think would be a very sensible idea. We're more than happy as an organisation to help deliver that.
And from a local authority point of view, is that something that the local authorities would want to participate in or have their own? Should we? How do we bring all this together, I guess, so everybody ends up knowing the same things and with the same tips and tricks, if you like? Catherine, how do you think we could make that work?
Yeah, I don't see why it wouldn't be of interest to those in local authorities to get some training. I would say that most of us, certainly in the planning department where I work, are very familiar with Teams now. We're using it on a day-to-day basis. To have meetings with developers, we have no sort of using that. But what we don't understand necessarily is what goes on behind the scenes from the PIN's perspective. So we don't know what ability you have to make someone a presenter, or allow someone to present, to share a screen, and allow someone not to, allow someone to speak, allow another person not to, and how that sort of element of things works. So, I think it would be beneficial to just sort of have an overview in that sense. And perhaps, there are still people out there who haven't used Teams in local authorities, particularly if their job doesn't involve a lot of computer work, then, and they're drawn into that sort of forum, then it could be very useful for them. Yeah.
I suppose the other aspect is, and maybe Simone could comment on because there's the behind the scenes bit, there's the how you run it. PIBA and local authorities, could help, and also bring in Rule 4 Rule 6s, and who knows. But there's the piece around how you're going to run the technology, and as Simone said, about who's going to provide that and where is it, and all of those sorts of aspects to it. So there's the training about that as well. And I think that is PIN's going to pick that challenge up.
Well, thank you. We have so far picked it up, and it is, or so far has been, a lot of work, because there was a lot of, a steep learning curve that we had to help so many people climb very quickly. And in that process, we had to take on a lot, in a way, of role that we so far never had to play, because in purely physical events, that was always the local authority usually, or, depending on who it is per casework, but it was always somebody else who did that for us. So it was actually a mammoth task that we took on, and all credit to our support staff and our inspectors for mastering that. As digital skills increase and get more, and as we can put more sort of standing guidance like videos and so on out there, we hope that we can reduce the amount of support that we need to give, because at times it felt like almost breaking us. But clearly we are very, very keen to keep as much casework moving that we can, and doing possible to do, to get as many cases moving. And in that process, I think now have developed more models so we can bring local authorities in, bring appellants and applicants in more, because together we then have a much bigger capacity to deliver even more. And I think that's where we want to focus next.
Thank you. Okay, and Christine, you wanted to come in on that.
Yes, I just wanted to say that I think it's an excellent idea to share good practice, and we can keep developing that as we did before when we had face-to-face events about best practice and good practice. But it's also really important, I think, to technology changing so quickly and improving all the time, that we keep improving all the time in the way in which we run events, and we don't just kind of build something for now on what we've got. Many of us are working off laptops. Is that really what we want? Do we want to be running an inquiry off our laptop, or do you want to? Is there a different way of doing things? We just need to keep thinking about technological solutions. That's all I wanted to say, Bridget.
No, and I think you're just a personal comment from me, and I actually utterly agree with Jonathan about how fatiguing it is not being able to read the body language. And as you say, there's as far as I understand it, there's some kind of there's some microscopic measurements that we're trying to make all the time, and you just can't do it on the screen. So that is one of the reasons why it's so exhausting, and I'm sure it's damaged my eyesight, all this stuff. Anyway, that's a personal reaction. So I think we need to kind of begin to wrap this up, because some interesting comments, which I hope everybody is reading in the comments, about the need for inspectors to remain in control of their inquiries. I think that's absolutely right. Comments on the on cross-examination, but I think we might just wrap up by thinking about fairness and well-being. and that's partly around how we're all managing this, and we wouldn't be able to do this webinar before. And when we finished the inquiries review, I think Christine's picking up on Christine's point, we didn't have this technology, or it was sort of there, but nobody was really using it. And now, of course, we're all using it, and that familiarity is then generating additional investment, which is a point that everybody has made. So that maximising access, maximising well-being for all of us, and making sure it's fair. I think I'd like to go round the table, as it were, and ask people, where do you think the balance lies, and what do we need to really, what is there one thing, what's the main thing that we should all be kind of thinking about and looking at in order to try and make sure we do this as well as we can? So balancing fairness, balancing well-being, balancing access. Simon, can I start with you and your perspective on this as a sort of the non-practitioner?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. I think the bit that I would say is just that we shouldn't assume that the current process actually is perfect for fairness, or the current the pre-existing physical actually it really limits the type of people who can be there, and it creates and I thought Catherine's description of some of the barriers it creates for local authority planning officers were really powerful as well. So I think the only thing I'd really do is just don't set this up as if, you know, if we carry on doing physical events, those are perfectly fair and everything else needs to be measured against that standard. I think we need to sort of be honest about the advantages and the opportunities and just trade the two, and really be hard about ourselves and work out what really are the risks we're worrying about. And, you know, I think we are genuinely worried about those who are digitally excluded, and what are the ways in which those can participate in the process. We are worried about sort of questions of, does this sort of unfairness in the process because people have got different, you know, weight in the system because of their power of their bandwidth or something, as in literally their bandwidth in this. And so I think there is a really important thing for us to keep on monitoring against a standard that the current the sort of physical examination system is a perfect gold standard, and everything else should be can only be less good than that.
That's a good point. And I'm just responding to somebody, right equipment is needed. Don't forget, we've done this because we all had to work from home. I hope in 6 months' time we won't have to work from home. We may well be running our virtual inquiries from our offices, or some of us go on working from home because that's what we do anyway, maybe what Jonathan does. But don't forget that the working from home piece may turn out to be have less legs, if you like, than the virtual event thing does. Anyway, some final comments as well. So, for, Simone, any final comment on fairness, wellness, and everything?
I think for me, the key actually also lies in the balance with the written, and to try and put as much into the written. In the, you know, like I said earlier, clearly our digital service overall needs to become much better, and hence us focusing so much, and me being excited now that we're getting closer to getting it, because I think enabling a better written engagement is just so crucial to be able to minimize the amount of event time that you need, and therefore the event time that you have, make that really good and fair.
Okay, right. Don't forget the written. Good point. Catherine, what about you?
Yeah, so on that written point, I think if you do increase the written element, I think you need to be conscious of the fact that you might need to increase the time before an inquiry or during an inquiry to allow that to take place, really. I certainly found it more difficult when the inquiry I dealt with had a lot of Scotch schedules involved in it, and that took a lot of time because you couldn't just get into a meeting with someone and, you know, run through things. It took a lot of backwards and forwards, and that took a lot of time. And I think just generally, I'd say just maintain flexibility, because even if lockdown does end, I know that quite a lot of officers are still going to want to work from home, probably quite a lot more than they did before. And if that does happen, then a physical event could be quite difficult for those who have childcare responsibilities in their normal, they normally balance that with that role, and they've got to a place now where they're sort of regularly doing that. So yeah, I wouldn't want to see it as people disadvantaged if the process became too inflexible.
So the well-being includes that flexibility. Okay, so that's a good point. Who next? Christine. You're on mute, Christine.
We've got to go forward, really. We've established this. We know that there are advantages. We know that there's digital exclusion, in so many areas. But I think we've got to go forward. We do need something that is a resilient model for us all. There's just a bit of work to do in there, utilising technology, being flexible. But I do think, big step change now, and we need to move forward.
Okay, and Jonathan.
On the question of fairness, fairness isn't a new issue, but one thing I would emphasise is that the PINs and individual inspectors have always been extremely good at making sure that the system, the process that's been adopted, is fair to all involved, and they've shown that they're able to do that during lockdown and with virtual events. So I've no hesitation saying that will continue, I'm sure. So far as well-being is concerned, I've made a number of points already about just being sensible about length of sessions, because it's tiring for everybody. And if I had any sort of recommendation, I think you probably picked up, I'm a big fan of blended events. I'm not suggesting that they're without their practical and other issues. And insofar as there ought to be a default position going forward, I think the ability of people who want to participate remotely, even if the main event is in person, I think should be facilitated wherever possible. And the final question about written representations, completely understand that, but there are two things about the written element to it. First of all, that it, as much as we'd like it to be, the written aspect of decision making isn't always as rigorous as having a hearing or having cross-examination. The other written aspect is that in order to focus on the issues, I think there needs to be a really big push, an even bigger push than PINS has hitherto been had, on having really focused and very detailed statements of common ground. So it's absolutely clear by the time you get to the event what issues everybody needs to concentrate on. That's on everybody.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. When I was doing the review of inquiries, I wanted to change that terminology to be the statement of uncommon ground, in order to try and get that focus, but we didn't actually, that felt a step too far at the time as a piece of terminology, but I am still very keen on that. Thank you for all your contributions this morning or this afternoon. We have run over slightly, and I'm sure you all have other things to do, and as we know, these events are quite tiring. So I want to thank both everybody who has listened. It will be available later as well. Thank you for everybody who put anything on the chat or indeed asked questions beforehand. The main message I'm taking away from this is we've still got lots of things to think about and lots of experimentation to do. And we will need to continue this kind of engagement in order to try and make sure that as the world evolves, as pandemic ends, hopefully, and vaccines come through, but we have learned a lot. We are not going to go backwards. We're going to go forwards, using more virtual over the next, the next whatever years. More things will be virtual, but not everything will be virtual, is the message I'm taking away from this. And we need to try and make sure that we can make that happen well. Thank you very much for your attendance. Please have a great weekend. Stay safe, stay well. Try to understand the guidelines. I know it's hard, but that's just about which tier you're in. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you.